The other day I was watching a video produced by the Distributist, and it was on the discussion of the impact of the sexual revolution. And while it's not the main focus of this video, he does mention, of course, in one of his videos, the topic of the sexualization of children and how that has to do with sexual education, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. But that's not what we're going to be talking about here today. Rather, I noticed something among the comments. Many people began to bring out this line that has become very common, almost ubiquitous in any conversation about the sexual revolution, and that is this idea, this sort of quote, well, there was a study once, the argument goes, there was a study once that shows that abstinence-only sexual education doesn't work. To put the argument more precisely, I believe the study found that the rates of teen pregnancy increased in areas where educators used an abstinence-only program versus a program which also advocated birth control. Now, this is a little bit silly. Here's an aside. This is a little bit silly in the context that people were bringing up this argument. It's just sort of a knee-jerk response to, spout the party line, because this had nothing to do with what the broader video, the broader point that the Distributist was making. Still, I wanted to take on this argument since it's so frequently used and have a little discussion about sort of the logic behind this argument, simply because I think it's a bad argument, not because I really have any dog in this fight about education, but I think the rationale of the argument shows a few really interesting flaws that maybe we can look at together here. So my primary objection has to do with a difference in moral systems. What we see here is there's a lot of assumed premises that the people who are going to employ the argument, for sake of a better term, might think of them as this is a more leftist perspective. So we could say the more left-leaning perspective here falls into a few assumptions that I think lead astray. The first assumption is that the primary objective is to reduce teen pregnancies. They cannot simply conceive of another reason for why someone would object to any sort of teenage sexual activity. And I think that's a huge pitfall in their understanding. There's this assumed common goal, and it's a very specific goal, which of course is necessary to have a measurable study. But many places, of course, those who are going to be advocating for an abstinence-only sort of sexual education, it's not simply because they think that this is going to lead to the lowest rates of teen pregnancy, but rather they see other moral implications in the act of premarital sexual activity or just a more sexualized culture. And we see that a lot, kind of the way these programs degrade into just more and more sexualized things. So a really interesting thing would be, right, there's different things that we could measure here. It would be equally interesting to see, okay, maybe this is something which reduces teen pregnancy, but does it reduce teen sexual activity? Is that in itself something that may, a legitimate goal that may be pursued? And I have a strong suspicion that simply saying, well, you're going to do it anyway, so here's how you should do it, is not the most effective way of achieving the end, depending on what your goals are. It's sort of like if you didn't want someone breaking into your house, giving them leather gloves so they could do it safely, smash your windows without cutting their hands. It might reduce the amount of cuts on burglars' hands, but does it actually negate the thing that we're trying to avoid here? So I think what we're seeing here is a difference in moral systems. Is it consequentialism? Is the morality of the act only determined by its consequence, or are we understanding the situation based on a sort of moral theory based on natural law or any other moral theory? I mean, you could look at this from a number of perspectives. And again, I've said this a lot, but I'm going to say it again. Perhaps a topic for another video to look deeper into moral systems. But I think until that central conflict can be resolved, this sort of objection to any discussion about the sexualization of children and teenagers by simply saying, well, the right solution doesn't reduce pregnancies as much, I think just is insufficient because we're not looking at addressing the same issues. But I have another defense. So that was my primary objection to the argument based on the study. My secondary argument is the title of this video, the Chestertonian defense. Now, G.K. Chesterton, in his book, What's Wrong with the World, he makes this very interesting argument that it's become sort of famous. Christianity has never been tried. It has been found hard and left untried. He ends up saying the same thing, ironically, about the ideals of the French Revolution. And where I agree with him in the former, I definitely disagree with him in the latter. But I think we can sort of apply the same idea in this argument here. If we think about it, has something like abstinence-only sexual education ever been tried? They may say, of course, there's tons of programs, tons of written curriculums, things like this that have been employed. But I feel like that's a very narrow view of education. We're looking at education merely as a 30-minute session, 45-minute class. One day we spend on this in our health class in high school, and there you go. You know everything you need to know. I don't really think that's how people's values, how people's understandings of the world are really formed. So if we take maybe a broader look at these different cultural elements, sort of maybe soft education versus hard education, I'm going to say define those terms. Hard education being like you're actually present in a school building. This is very defined, very clear-cut education, where the soft education is more like the cultural things which inform you. So if we think of these terms, the soft education would be things like, when it comes to sexual education, would be things like, movies, television, pop culture, music, pornography, all these different areas where people, teen magazines, very famously, you could look at sort of the degeneracy of kind of these like teenage girl magazines, or what these people are advocating for, especially on the left here, are good examples of a very different perspective. So if you look at all of these different influences and then you weigh them against, the influence of, like I said, maybe a 30-minute lecture or something in a biology class or health class you have once in high school. I think the idea that sexual education and abstinence-only sexual education has been tried and found wanting is really a naive and really a narrow way of looking at this. It doesn't really explore all the elements of sexual education. Because I agree, if the objection is that merely writing an abstinence-only curriculum or something like that, merely presenting this idea once in a class is going to change things, I agree that that's probably impractical. But I think would be a more fair representation of what is meant maybe by an abstinence-only sexual education would be something like a culture in which these ideals are valued. So I'll say, as Chesterton says with Christianity, it has not been tried and found wanting, but that rather it has been seen as hard and left untried. Now, having just said that, I'm going to sort of contradict myself here and say, perhaps it has been tried. Perhaps we could look at an example if we were to go back into the past, look at sort of a pre-sexual revolution cultures. Certainly, Christendom, the medieval cultures, even before the 1920s. The 1920s, I would say, was sort of a sexual revolution in its own right, even though not nearly as famous as the one in the 1960s. But if we were to go back and look at these cultures previous to our own, what would we see? And that's a difficult question to answer. I certainly don't think that I'm going to be able to answer for you guys here now. And one of the reasons it's so difficult to answer is that, well, certainly teen pregnancy was not an issue that people were that worried about back in the day, but that's because, well, for one, the category of a teenager wasn't really something that existed, especially not in the medieval era. It's sort of an invention in the modern world. So, that leaves us pondering, doesn't it? But I think we can still maybe glean a few lessons. If we are to think of a hypothetical situation where a young girl were to become pregnant in, say, pre-1920s, or you mean further back in the medieval world, what would be the expectation? I think what we would find, I think what can be found through limited historical data that we can observe, is something like a very large, what was it that my one professor called it? A very large rate of 8-month pregnancy, something like that, or 7-month pregnancy, something like that. I can't remember what the term was. It's quite funny. But this idea that when these things happen, and you can see tons of testimonies, things, the idea is that, well, the couple needs to get married. That's the solution, that the way you can kind of cover up and avoid shame. And so I think that that's an interesting idea. I think that leads us to a different place and a different understanding of how these problems are seen, how they're understood, what the consequences are. But again, it all comes back to a number of things. It comes back to kind of what the values of the society are and what the objective is. So simply saying that abstinence-only education is not going to reduce the number of pregnancies is a very simplified examination. It really falls short of a fuller understanding of what's being discussed here. And again, it prevents people from really engaging with the ideas that are being presented. It's just sort of a fallback defense. Well, there was a study once. Maybe we can have a longer video sometime about the problems with scientific materialism, but simply saying there was a study once, therefore I'm right, really cuts short the sort of logical and philosophical context that these studies and this data has to be put in. Well, I'm going to end this video here. I think I've talked about this topic long enough. Hopefully you found some of it interesting. If so, feel free to leave a comment and we can continue the discussion.